of inflation, inflation target. As you know, that we have also had, thanks to Professor Goyal, we also participated in the G20. We did 21 webinars in that, 10 on new international economic order. We did on women empowerment 6, and then we did 5 on climate. And we have continued to follow these themes. Countries passing through various stages, but one issue which is coming up repeatedly is fiscal consolidation. We're in the midst of Finance Commission. The Finance Commission is going around the country and almost finishing their city visits. And when this book came to my notice, and I saw Pinaki there, who's been associated with the Finance Commission and still writes once in a while, I thought this is the right time to talk about it. Then Partha was there, a dear friend. So we have organized this discussion on the fiscal policy. It's a fantastic book. You have seen it. It's gone with a flyer to all of you. It's a fantastic book. And there are 3 authors there. To discuss this book on fiscal policy, whom else to go? Professor Ashima has worked on this area, guided, written extensively. So obviously we requested her and she kindly agreed to chair this session. Professor Ashima Goyal is our advisor at EGROW. She's been a professor at IGIDR. She has been a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, and she has just completed her tenure on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Reserve Bank of India, extensively published. Our main speaker for today is Professor Partha, again a colleague of mine from the Reserve Bank of India. Again, like me, I picked up a job at IIM Bangalore, he picked up a job at IIM Calcutta, and now he's the director at an IBM. Again, extensively published and has written on many issues. His beautiful book on the monetary policy, small, elegant book, I think is a handbook of monetary policy for many of us who have taught at IIMs. Our second speaker for today is Professor Pinaki, again a dear friend who's been with us for many times at our forum. He has also been working on fiscal issues. He was the director of National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. He has been a member associated with the Finance Commission. And now he's a distinguished professor again at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. With this brief introduction of the speakers and the need for this discussion, I hand over the session to Professor Ashima Goyal to take the proceedings further. Professor Goyal.
Thank you, Charan. So I must say, I feel very proud being associated with EGROW. And I'm sure you personally must be one of the wisest people in India. You heard 218 seminars and yeah. But, I must, it's really good to see that we get people coming and talking from the remotest corners of India, as well as from all over the world. So, a very balanced perspective coming out of it all. And again, I'm delighted to be on a panel with Partha, I think he was a student in one of the first classes I taught in actually.
Yes, indeed.
And we've interacted over the years, so it's really nice to see him here. And Pinaki also has helped us out at IGIDR very often. He was examiner for one of my students. And again, we've interacted and collaborated in many ways. He brings out these excellent edited collections in EPW, in fiscal issues, budget. So Charan, he's the biggest expert going in this area. So, when I looked at this, unfortunately, I haven't read the book, but I'm sort of familiar with the views of all 3 authors. So when I read the title, I was thinking it's an unusual title, Financial and Fiscal Policies. So I was thinking, what is a way to sort of, where does this title come from? And for me, the term I'm familiar with is fiscal and financial dominance, for monetary policy. So in India, do we have fiscal and or financial dominance? And does it affect the way macro policy is conducted? Whenever I think of an Indian economy policy question, I like to start with the structure of the economy, the kind of shocks we face, and the circumstances we are in currently. So, and these circumstances are very interesting when one thinks of fiscal policy. Because for most emerging markets, as Charan was reminding us, and not just it's the advanced economies more than the emerging markets now, debt explosion, fiscal consolidation is a major, major issue. And India really stands out as being a country which is being somewhat conservative and is actually bringing down deficits and debt, which is very, very unusual. So I had a general equilibrium macro model in which I had first asked this question. And in that, I had my preconception in going into that. It had a dual economy structure, with that, to reflect our labor market, and some consumers who are well off and others who are not. And my preconception when I went into it was that such an economy as it's a catch-up can have higher growth, and this can bring down debt. So the results surprised me somewhat, because the one interesting result was that the higher that debt grows with higher growth, debt grows more. And higher the debt is, the more it grows. So, and this was in the 2000s, and that time India was going through this high growth phase. And what I saw around me was exactly this, because the government used, large revenue growth to really spend more, to put up in a lot of money into construction in rural areas. And we saw inflation really going up. Real wages rose at unheard of rates in India at that time. And after that, we know what happened in the 2010s. We had double deficits, we had outflows, we had, people were saying India is going the Latin American way. And so we had a decade of extra tight macroeconomic policies. So, and recently I gave a talk at the Madras School of Economics, and Dr. Rangarajan was saying that, and this current MPC, we've been talking about monetary fiscal coordination, and how that has helped give us robust growth, bring down inflation. We are seeing these results, right? And at the same, very low growth sacrifice. So, and I've been writing about this and saying that monetary fiscal policy coordination has been possible in terms of this MPC, and that has really contributed. And Dr. Rangarajan said that it's very difficult to have this coordination. We used to be always fighting with the government. And we agreed then that it was because circumstances were very different then. You had a government which was spending too much, just very not finding ways to escape responsibility legislation, etc. So again, I had a paper where I said that India's structure, where very often interest elasticity of demand is high, so monetary policy affects output more, and there are supply side shocks, so fiscal policy affects inflation from the supply side. That in this structure, the delegation that would be optimal in Indian conditions is to a conservative finance minister and a pro-growth central bank. And luckily, that was the combination we had the last few years. And so in my view, currently, we don't have fiscal dominance. We are using our high growth to bring down debt. And of course, there are problems, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot about that as we continue the evening. Now, coming to financial dominance, another interesting perspective I had in the MPC was that you can look at financial dominance in many senses. And when you're comparing it with monetary policy or fiscal policy, it's about financial sector concerns dominating or restraining other policy. But here, I find financial dominance in the sense that RBI interacts with and listens to the financial sector much, much more than to the real sector. And under inflation targeting, where what happens to the nominal interest rate matters to so many analysts, to the financial sector, with the positions they're going to take. There's so much discussion of the nominal repo rate, about forecasts, about the possible path forward, etc. So I used to always emphasize in the minutes and in the discussions that the MPC should focus on the real rate because it's neglected in the noise that goes on around the MPC. And the real rate is what affects consumption, investment, the real sector, which ultimately is necessary for the financial sector also to do well. So, that was one sort of takeaway for me, the sense in which there's financial dominance in India. But the traditional financial dominance in the sense of crisis, stress, contagion, spillovers. We're seeing more of that in advanced economies than in emerging markets. Most of the financial crises have originated from outside. And in India, for example, we've been able to handle this, as I said, quite well. Through the 2010s, we had very tight financial, fiscal, monetary policies. We had slow growth. We had the NPA issue, but and that as well as the perception that emerging markets are risky, all creates the view that Indian financial sector is fragile. That tends to be the dominant view. So again, I've been arguing and writing against that. In my view, and we've done some careful research on prudential regulation. We find that this is applied much more.
Ma'am, you are mute.
Okay, sorry, my hands are wandering around. So Dr. Reddy, one of the co-authors of this book, was the first to apply dynamic prudential regulation in the 2000s, before the world started talking about it. And that helped us come out of the global financial crisis with less spillovers, etc. So, and overall, I think that together with more diversification, a combination of public ownership as well as market. Now it's not banks alone that are lending for infrastructure. We have development finance institutions again. And Partha has been pushing for the importance of having these institutions and other kinds of finance. So all this creates diversity and makes our financial sector more stable, in my view, of course. So I look forward to hearing your perspectives and to an interesting discussion, please. Partha, you wanted to start with some slides.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Goyal. Thanks, Charan, for inviting Pinaki and me. Dr. Reddy is sorry that he's unable to join today. So we will use a slide for the purpose of carrying out the discussion. Is this visible, ma'am?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So this is a joint work, a work with Reddy, me, and Pinaki. It has earlier another edition of the book. Roughly tells the story of the global economy during 2000 to 2024. The first edition came out in 2014. This looked at global financial crisis and euro area crisis, whereas this particular edition, we have looked much more contemporary issues like US trade war a little bit, the UK Brexit, the COVID-19, and associated geopolitical risk these days increasingly. What we tried to do in the second edition is essentially we thought, and Professor Goyal said it rightly, typically the twin approach of monetary and fiscal policy is discussed more often. So why do you bring finance and financial sector as somewhere? So we basically attempt to explore the emerging issues in the policies relating to management of public debt, central banking, taxation, and regulation of the financial sector. And we urge you that an important lesson for public policy is that sound fiscal management is at the heart of maintaining financial stability consistent with growth. And this is, we were talking of the global economy. In fact, excepting one chapter, we do not discuss India at all. This will basically look at the broader picture. We argue the sound fiscal management demands adequate space for the conduct of public policy at the national level while navigating the forces of globalization in particularly of finance. And this is independent of the ownership structure of banking or financial sector. It's like we were greatly, impressed by a book by David Moss, saying if all else fails. So irrespective of the ownership, even if it's the private ownership of banks and financial sector, we have seen in crisis period, the government takes over. So yes, it is indeed a complex challenge to reconcile the considerable advantage of the independence of monetary authorities and regulators with the compulsions of coordination, which Professor Goyal has mentioned, and without ignoring the criticality of fiscal policies. So that's in some sense the broad story. This is the chapterization that we have. So we have sort of one slide for each chapter. We'll try to be brief. And potentially the things which have a whole fiscal emphasis, Pinaki is going to discuss, others I'm going to discuss. So the red colored ones are being discussed by Pinaki, others I'm going to discuss. In some sense, the broad way, we all know the global financial crisis story, its genesis. What started as a subprime crisis has become increasingly a global financial crisis. My former boss, Dr. Rakesh Mohan, however, differed with us in branding it global financial crisis. He coined a term called North Atlantic Financial Crisis, NAFC. We, however, stick to more traditional term called global financial crisis. In a sense, we realized that in that crisis, the immediate solution to handling the crisis was in terms of monetary and fiscal stimulus. And in that chapter, we discussed the genesis, how it came up with the complex derivative products, and then how an ultra-accommodative monetary policy given a fillip, how the global imbalance made a difference in the pricing of risks in the United States, and all these combination together and a lax inflation, all this combination together gave rise to the global financial crisis, and its solution package essentially was initially reduction of the federal fund rate in US coupled with others, and then followed by essentially ultra accommodative monetary policy with quantitative easing, and at the same time hugely accommodative fiscal policies. That was broadly the background. We start with the global financial crisis. From there, we move to the impact of the crisis on fiscal position, and I'll request Pinaki to take over. Pinaki, over to you. Pinaki, are you able to see this?
Yes.
Yeah, please. You can take over, and I will again come forward later.
So in this book, we try to look at the impact of the crisis on fiscal position. There are many issues that become particularly relevant in the context of financial sector and the monetary policy. But what I would like to do here, given that the time is short, I'll briefly discuss the major fiscal issues emerging at the global level, and also some of the issues that we have discussed specific to India. So if we look at the adverse effect of the macroeconomic uncertainties arising due to the war and the pandemic, there's a structural shift in the way we look at fiscal policy, and that has been highlighted in the book. And these changes can be broadly classified in three broad categories. One is, of course, the falling revenues, both tax and non-tax. In turn, rise in the level of deficit, and also because of the COVID pandemic, there is this increase in the discretionary spending. So in turn, a lot of the fiscal stimulus that was introduced during the COVID still continue to be there at the global level, and the global public debt is now at around 92% of GDP, global GDP. And though we had seen some contraction in the debt to GDP ratio immediately after the crisis, I think global, but if we look at data from 22-23, for the year 22-23 and 23-24, and some evidence is emerging after the book has been published. There has been a possibility that the global public debt to GDP ratio would be 100% of GDP by 2030-31. So that is one issue that becomes very relevant. So we are having an elevated level of debt post the global financial crisis. This also has led to a let me rethinking about the global fiscal rules. We do discuss that in we discuss that in the paper, and also there has been this issue of how this adverse fiscal situation has an impact on the macro policy in terms of fiscal monetary coordination and the kind of effect we see that on growth and development. So I'll just just talk about, since it's a revised edition and some of the new issues that we have discussed, I'll just highlight those. I think the increase in the book discusses here, the increasing fiscal imbalance, government debt during the current crisis is much faster than the increase in debt and deficit during the global financial crisis. So that is one major change that we see if we look at the increase in the magnitude of debt and deficit. Secondly, the debt has increased at a faster rate in the advanced economies during the COVID, followed by the EMEs and the low-income developing countries. The kind of fiscal expansion that we see during COVID and post-COVID is a lot of fiscal expansion in the advanced economies and the emerging market economics. So we see a set of, so if we look at the global data on emerging market economics, less developed economics, and the advanced economies, you will see that large-scale fiscal expansion in countries who can spend more actually can afford to have more tax cuts, but the country which are poor and have very little fiscal space actually have not significantly expanded even during the crisis. So that is that issue that we bring out, and it has implications in terms of development, global inequality, social sector, human development, SDGs, etc. So those issues that are brought out in this book. Then also we have talked about very briefly about the rising global inequality, and we make a distinction between the discussion on inequality that is emerging now and before. That means during the global financial crisis, the pre-global financial crisis period, that time we are having high growth, high inequality. We are now talking about a situation where we have very uncertain growth and very high level of inequality. So there is a distinction between what was happening pre-global financial crisis and what is happening now in terms of growth. Then briefly we discuss about the climate change mitigation and net zero issues in terms of what is going to happen to the fiscal crisis, or how that is going to be addressed when there is a major fiscal strain because of the rise in debt and debt to GDP ratio, because of the uncertainties and the fiscal crisis that we had during the COVID. Then we also talked about the kind of stimulus the global economy has given and the kind of fiscal risk it poses. And if we look at the total global stimulus that was estimated, and as per the IMF data when the book was written, it was around $21,000 billion. And out of this $21,000 billion, $4,000 billion was given through the banks. So it was a bank-supported stimulus. So it does not appear in the books of accounts of the government. So it is somewhere there in the system, global system, and if this has to be later on support, these are all government guaranteed. So if this $4,000 billion will have to come into the government's books of account, I think the fiscal deficit and debt ratio that we see now will be much larger. So there is a large amount of hidden fiscal risk at the global level because of the kind of bank supported fiscal stimulus that was given during the global financial crisis. So these are some of the issues that we discussed in terms of crisis. I would give it to Partha, Professor Roy, to discuss the global economy and the 21st century.
Okay, so moving forward, if you look at the global economy in the 21st century, we just present two figures giving the growth trajectory and the inflation trajectory. The growth trajectory makes a couple of things very clear. First, Asia has clearly emerged as a growth pole, and the Asian growth is the highest. The light blue colored chart, light blue colored line in the top chart, whereas the advanced countries and others are lower. But this at the same time emphasize that these two major crises, one is the global financial crisis, the second is pandemic, their remarkable synchronicity across the globe. Despite the fact these are up, it's not that they're completely insulated. So these twin forces of Asia being the top, pulling the growth rate, at the same time, a remarkable synchronicity across the growth numbers is what we notice. And we also note that in between there are resurgences, because in terms of crisis, we have seen global financial crisis, then we have seen euro area crisis, then the smaller, upsetting events like Brexit and others. Then finally, you get to see the pandemic, and post that, the geopolitical tension and the US-China trade war. In between, the resurgence of growth globally was transitory, uneven, and fragile. I'm not talking of India, I'm talking of the global economy. And, at least in the earlier, by the end of, after the 2000 crisis, it was apparent the euro area would be affected by a sovereign debt crisis. Of course, there are various dimensions of the euro area crisis, which is the discussion for the next chapter. And, we also looked at in between inflation was hardly a problem, but post-pandemic inflation really emerged as a major problem everywhere, including the emerging markets. Moving further, in terms of euro area economies, we realized we do not have necessarily one story. The so-called the GIPS countries, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, we looked at in each of these countries in somewhat greater detail. And we thought, this is a proverbial Leo Tolstoy starting Anna Karenina by saying all happy families are alike, or unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. So in that sense, there are country-specific stories there. Greece and Italy essentially suffered from debt problem. Portugal had a productivity problem. Iceland, which is not part of the euro area, but they wanted to enter at that point of time, there was a banking problem and overexposure to foreign debt, and Spain and Ireland had housing problem. So despite all the things, they in some sense paid the price of being part of a less than optimum currency area. There are internal tensions between them. And today, at that point of crisis, of euro area crisis, had drachma been there, our perception says drachma must have depreciated by something like maybe 100%, but not having drachma at that point of time and not having an euro at that point of time, perhaps Greece paid dearly. Just one country, but different countries paid their own price. So despite the country specificity of their own crisis, the euro area was less than an optimum currency area, and at that point of time, not having an unified fiscal authorities, they paid dearly in terms of the crisis. When it comes to India, there was, of course, we have been have given the stimulus, despite the near zero export of Indian banks. Given the extent of globalization, India was affected by the global financial crisis. There have been both monetary and fiscal area. Mr. Singh asked a question we'll discuss later. Maybe there may be a discuss for the South Globe. India was affected by it. Indian authorities have undertaken a substantial fiscal stimulus in 2008-9 at that point of time. And I entirely agree with Professor Goyal. Later on, perhaps during the pandemic and others, it was somewhat more conservative, and rightly so. And therefore, even the withdrawal for fiscal stimulus later on was somewhat easy. I'll request Pinaki to take over to talk on India and later on go to other issues on public debt. Pinaki, over to you. Pinaki?
The connection problems again? He's not,
Yeah.
we can't see.
Am I audible now?
You are
Yes,
audible.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. We have looked at India's fiscal response and compared India's fiscal response with the G20 countries and the
Can't hear
emerging
you.
other emerging market economies, and our analysis shows that
Are you able to hear him, Professor Goyal?
No, I can't hear.
No, I'm able to hear him. I mean,
Okay, I'm stopping my video because it's coming, message is coming here, weak connection. Let's see if it gets better. I can't hear you.
Pinaki, you need to unmute and talk.
Can you hear him now?
No, I'm not able to hear Pinaki, but I'm able to hear you, Professor Goyal.
Yeah. I can't see Charan either. Charan, are you there? His video is off.
Yeah, I'm around.
Yeah.
I'm
Pinaki, you
wondering
can't hear
why-
Pinaki either, right?
Yeah.
So,
Pinaki?
Partha,
Yeah, I'll possibly go ahead.
yeah,
And
he's
once
coming.
Pinaki join, he can take over.
I
Okay?
think he's joined.
Pinaki has joined.
Partha,
Pinaki?
go ahead.
am I audible?
You
Yes,
are,
yes, you're audible. Please go ahead.
you
Am I
are
audible?
You
Yes.
are audible, Pinaki. Pinaki, please go ahead.
Okay. So if we look at India's debt to GDP ratio during COVID, it was around 92% of GDP. Now it is around 83% of GDP. We also have looked at the kind of fiscal response India made, and also we try to analyze the kind of fiscal framework that we have in India in terms of managing debt to GDP ratio. And at the general conclusion that we have on Indian chapter is that we still have a debt, though there has been significant fiscal contraction after the COVID pandemic. Our debt ratio now, taking center and states together, is around 80 to 83% of GDP, which is very high compared to what was targeted to be achieved in 23. That was 60% of GDP. We also make this analysis of general government debt, taking center and states together, and we do see a significant correction in debt to GDP ratio at both the union and state level. However, given the composition of general government debt is heavily skewed towards central governments, accounting for almost more than two-thirds of the general government debt, we argue that a significant reduction in debt to GDP ratio is only possible if there is a faster reduction in debt to GDP ratio of the union government. That is one important conclusion of the chapter. Second important issue that we also discuss about the kind of asymmetric fiscal FRBMs, fiscal responsibility framework that we have for the union and states. One is the issue of kind of focus on revenue deficit and the focus on fiscal deficit, taking center and subnational government, because we have a separate chapter on subnational governments global level, but we discuss India, and since subnational data on fiscal data is not very easily available for all the emerging countries, we try to look at some of the things that at India, some subnational public finance data in detail for India. And we also and in this context, we have the asymmetry that we see in terms of the fiscal responsibility legislation also shows the kind of contraction that the states have to do, and in that context, we also highlight the assignment of revenue and expenditure at the union and state level, and argue that given that more redistributive expenditures are at the state level compared to the center. The kind of and if there is a greater contraction at the state level compared to the center, and the kind of fiscal response that we are talking about, that there has to be more redistributive fiscal space at the household level. We may see a very different kind of a disconnect between the kind of contraction that we would see at the subnational level vis-a-vis at the union level. So that's the second issue that we discussed. Third issue at the I would also like to, at the global level, we would like to see, we discussed in the book, is there is this OECD work on subnational public finances during the COVID crisis, and we draw some very important lessons from this OECD comparative work on how subnational government responded during the crisis. And we found a couple of very interesting insights, and that becomes an important component of the important data points of the book. And there we draw a couple of very important conclusions, and I just wanted to highlight that. One issue is that more immediate responses were provided by the subnational governments in terms of during COVID. Most of the redistributive household support spending was done by the subnational government. Third response was in terms of delivery of public services for livelihood, for life, in terms of health support, etc., was also provided by the subnational governments. And there is this phenomenal similarity across the federal governments in the world in terms of response. Second important aspect that we observed was the limited fiscal autonomy in which the subnational government worked across the global across various countries, across federal countries. Third issue that we highlighted is that at the global level, subnational debt also has increased enormously, and so we argue that there is a need for a coordinated exit from the large fiscal expansion that we see at the subnational level, but this needs to be coordinated with the federal at the federal level in terms of reduction, because in many countries federal debt is also very high. Here also we discuss about the composition of debt. Some of the emerging market economies and the low income developing countries, you would see that they also have large exposure to external debt. From that point of view, I think we have a better situation in terms of management of risk, because our external debt exposure from the government account is very limited. And last issue that we have discussed also in this book on the subnational finances is the issue of third tier of government. So third tier of government, very limited data, very limited understanding, but where there globally, whatever limited data we had, we saw there is a clear pattern. Wherever the urban governments were very strong, I think the responses were also very different. How that has worked, played out 4 years down the line after COVID is something which you do not know, need to be documented, but that is an issue that has been highlighted in the book. Thank you.
Should I move over, Pinaki?
Yeah, I think he wants you to take.
Yeah. Okay. So we are almost at the end of our presentation. Broadly, this 150-page plus book gives sort of finally ends with a discussion on the emerging challenges. We highlight the emerging challenges for the public policies, and we feel that while the link between the fiscal management and conduct of monetary policy is quite discussed, financial regulation also needs to be closer. And I comment that Mr. Goyal has mentioned in her introduction. Of course, there are efforts to put appropriate institutional arrangement at the national level as well as elsewhere. For example, in Euro area now, they're talking increasingly of certain fiscal synchronization. Earlier they were not, and they realized that this, one monetary policy and 17 fiscal policies could make a difference. Of course, we know growth and financial stability are very interlinked, and therefore, in case of developing economies, arrangements may have to be considered for the related issues of employment and output. However, in discussing such arrangements for coordination, we must realize that financial regulation should not get diluted, and occasionally some degree of failure of certain financial institutions would be the order in various countries' circumstances. It is, of course, possible that accountability will be different to enforce these in absence of well-defined objectives. Of course, this is a complex reality that has to be faced by each country. Of course, we know that limitations of global monetary we have been deeply appalled by, we termed it as global monetary non-system. This was Dr. Reddy's favorite phrase, that often the IMF, the World Bank, the BIS of the thing, they are unable to effectively intervene there, and therefore there's increasing interlink between the financial system, where Wall Street has huge interest, and the financial markets world over. So these have significant implications of different degree for financial and fiscal policies, directly or indirectly. We'll stop our presentation here. We can take questions or comments from them.
Excellent summary of a really rich book. So just to raise some interest, some issues, and I think there's some questions in the chat also. This issue of the huge rise in public debt through the world, and your initial observation that is at the heart of possible financial instability. Because what happened, I think advanced economies are really responsible for much of the rise in debt. As Pinaki said, emerging markets had less space and increased debt much less. And they needed to spend more, possibly. But, after the global financial crisis, there was a view that monetary policy did too much. There was quantitative easing and interest rates below zero, trying to push rates below zero, etc. While fiscal policy did not do enough. And the debate was that since global savings are in excess, interest rates are low, they're likely to remain low. So therefore, that growth greater than interest rate can bring down debt. I think Blanchard just really pushed this view that the government needs to spend more. So I think after the pandemic, the government internalized this, and there was too much fiscal stimulus. Huge. Europe, Pinaki was talking about redistributive. I know we have a friend whose son used to run an NGO in the Netherlands, and he got this huge check from the government. And the company was shut, nothing he could do, so he used that to travel the world. So, and this led to such a rise in debt. And then we saw that inflation rose. It was not expected to rise. Inflation was thought to be anchored. Interest rates were thought to be going to be low, but they rose. And as a result, the interest burden rises, and that leads to potential financial instability. We're seeing that US treasuries now are at much higher than they used to be, which means that the cost of servicing this debt has gone up for the US economy. So isn't that a potential sort of disciplining device in the future? The realization that you can't spend as much as you want without affecting inflation and interest rates. So is that something that is possible, that can lead to a change for the better in this tendency to overspend of advanced economy governments? Then the other issue, I think you touched on this briefly, is about net zero. And the fact that these less developed economies are the ones who are most susceptible to climate events arising from global pollution created by advanced economy overconsumption. They are not responsible for it. But, and I was chairing a T20 session, Sharon was referring to this during India's G20 presidency. And one of the facts that really struck me then was we looked at financing of green initiatives in emerging markets, the money available for this. That about 1/4 of what is available globally comes to emerging markets, and it's 4 times more expensive because of the perceived risk. But a lot of this risk arises because of excess volatilities due to global shocks and movements of capital flows and so on. So how can you kind of get around this? But also, if you're able to, some standards, some platforms, some project readiness, some development finance institutions, and bring more of this money and link it to, it might be a solution for debt. Link it to debt reduction, as well as reforms that improve the global public good, for which global money is keen, right? So whether that is a possible way to ameliorate emerging market debt. And then I had a question about Greece. You talked about the pigs economy, and Greece suffered because they didn't have a separate currency. But Greece is one of the in the recent period, one of the stars of the European economy, in the sense they've really turned around. So what was it that they did, and how were they able to deal with their debt and bring it down, etc.? And what are the implications for the future? Then the last question I had really was about third tier and the subnational spending. So I think in India, we've not given enough, the center has not given enough decentralization of the states not enough to the third tier. And as a result, public services which are at that level of the municipality and so on, or the panchayat, are really underprovided to the citizen. And sometimes redistribution is an easy way out for these governments, like this, all these Mahila schemes and so on. And actually you need to improve air quality, health, education, all those services. So, therefore, some of the central schemes that substitute for the lack of these services, and do they have a role, therefore? And that was one question. So I think before we turn, would you like to kind of take up some of these issues or anything else? Any other questions? Charan, you want to come in? Anybody else?
I think your questions are very good. Partha, to begin with, I think our questions are very good, but in the book you have been speaking about the Euro area, the banking union and the fiscal union, right? And so much has been happening there. So if you could, while you are answering Professor Goyal's, if you want to mention that. And the Euro area, you and me both were there at the IMF. We know that when the Greece crisis was taking place, many people felt that it's time for Euro to split. And you know that Madame Lagarde said, my son was born when the Euro had already been settled. He doesn't know the pre-Euro area. So therefore, where is the question of split of Euro? We are only going to go ahead. But you have seen recently, and certainly in recent years, you do think, okay, something is happening in the Euro area. How is it going to really fan out? As far as Professor Goyal is concerned, the Greek story is a fascinating story. Many countries, you and me were together when Greek story was playing out. Many countries thought that Greece is gone.
Right.
And then the IMF and the Europeans, like a little duckling, held it, and you know that it has bounced back to be an equal partner. There is a very interesting story about how they go and take care of their ducklings. Right? So I totally agree with the questions she raised. Looking forward to your.
Okay, a couple of these very, very, very important, interesting questions. I'll respond to some of them. First, to begin with, yes, indeed, the advanced countries were extremely fiscally profligate. On a personal note, I can tell a story. I used to be in Maryland, and we had a Bengali Theatre Association, which actually got $7,000 as grant around that time, in the peak of the 2008 crisis. So it's like they were indeed profligate. Now, when it comes to Euro area initially, countries like Greece thought with the help of Euro, they can get the advantage of a high rating and pursue, therefore, at the same time, they would be fiscally quite lax, at the same time, access the Euro debt market at a very low interest rate. Now, the thing that dawned on them after the crisis, that you cannot eat the cake and have it too. So one is certain sense of responsibility willingly were injected to them. One. Second, the tourism economy hit back. There is now a term for Greek economy called the cafe economy. So many of the earlier ambitious things, they sort of winded up, had realized that tourism is their sector, tourism and marine products in their sector, along with some degree of shipbuilding. So all the core sectors that they concentrated, and thereby they had it. Realizing that they cannot piggyback on Euro, And in this, the emphasis on fiscal union and emphasis on a pseudo banking union, though not entirely effective, has been to some extent have been very helpful in terms of reduction of rate. And why Greece alone? All the so-called gyps or pigs countries have come out of the crisis. Whether it's Portugal or it's Italy, Ireland came out in remarkable period. Ireland was out of the crisis within a year or so. So all those euro area countries have come out of the crisis.
So would you say that it was discipline that contributed, that there was not a fiscal union and they had to sort of focus on their comparative advantage in some,
yes,
rather than just free riding on cheap loans and so on?
Yes, good policy and good luck because tourism came back. So post-COVID tourism came back huge. So I'm saying a combination of the two, they got the benefit. Finally, on last thing about when it comes to the advanced country public debt thing, they got the advantage of their currency. Typically the G4 currency, the pound sterling, euro, yen, and dollar, they got an advantage which others did not get. So therefore, that India avoided the original sin. Original sin was having a disproportionately large external debt denominated in dollar has been very helpful to India. This is some lesson that the world needs to know. We have been hugely criticized for our conservative, or RBI use the term calibrated approach to financial liberalization or capital account liberalization, but in retrospect, it seems that helps us hugely.
Right, right.
I'll stop here. Pinaki, anything to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add two things. One is, something that we should have discussed, but we came to the conclusion. So I take just 1 minute to say that we have a separate section in the book on Chinese debt and global financial stability. And I just wanted to quote 3 numbers. One is, if we look at low and middle income countries combined debt to China, this is as per 2020 data was $170 billion. And to put this figure in the context of low and middle income countries, combined obligation to the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development were $204 billion at the end of 2020. So the kind of rise of Chinese lending to the low income developing economies and how that is going to impact global financial system and can have and on debt restructuring is an issue that would have to be discussed more in detail as we move and the global financial system moves. We have been talking about in the short to medium term. So that is one issue that has not been adequately discussed. We searched a lot, and there are only a couple of papers which actually had this data, and World Bank has some research done on it. But this is something which is emerging on the question of in the global financial system, but the more research, more analysis, more understanding is required. So that is one issue that is new in the book in the second edition. So on the question of fiscal, expansion by advanced economies, emerging economies, and low-income developing economies, I think I was trying to say something like this. Where we have been analyzing rise in global public debt by looking at this broad macro number of global debt to GDP ratio at 92-93%, expecting it to go up further. So there is a fiscal crisis that needs to be tackled. But the issue is very different if we look at countries which did not have fiscal space and could not spend. So we are, and that's why we see an asymmetry in recovery post-COVID. And if we look at the composition of spending because of this large fiscal stimulus, the spending for life and livelihood during the global crisis, lockdown, etc., was only 5 to 6% of the total fiscal stimulus. So economies which actually recovered quickly actually spend a lot of money as fiscal stimulus. A very and the share of money spent on basically to deal with COVID was very small. Now, but that's not the case in many of the low-income developing countries, but they suffered the COVID shock as much as a high-income or an advanced or an emerging economy has suffered. So in that context, the kind of rising inequality, growth inequality that we see, also discussion about reforming the global financial system, we see is happening because actually the nature of response during COVID was very asymmetric and unequal. So that is one point that I wanted to say. Second, on the question of Greece, I think we when Greece was in crisis, and there was this huge movement in Greece against austerity. I think we really cannot take a binary position on austerity, 0 and 1. The austerity is bad, good, and any fiscal response which will support household is bad. I think that kind of a position we cannot take. One of the reasons why Greece has recovered, I think government support continued to the extent possible within the available constraint of fiscal space. So that's my understanding of why Greece has recovered. One of the major reasons. Last point that I wanted to highlight on the question of local service delivery response. This is very asymmetric across countries. We actually do not have clear evidence on this, but one institutional issue that becomes very important to note, the countries where local governments are very powerful, they're the middle level. If there's a third tier government, the middle level government is not very powerful. Take the case of South Africa, where the local governments are very powerful, but the provincial governments are very limited fiscal autonomy. So in that context, I think institutional structure is also very important. And as far as response is concerned, response is also, emergency response is different. But when it comes to redistributive fiscal spending, it is decided by the assignment of expenditure, and what the commonality that we find across countries is that most of the redistributive spending are at the subnational level. So from that point of view, when we look at macro stability, these differences in expenditure assignment cannot be ignored. Thank you.
Sure. I have just one comment. In the chat box, I see number of comments by SN saying, one of them being, are these supported by quantity variable? We have a book, all the data are there in the book. It would be impossible for us to have a full reading session of the book. Would appreciate it.
Yes, yes.
Professor Goyal, can I ask?
He's also saying that things that policy should be different for advanced economies and developing economies. For the discussion, or is there any sort of systematic difference in? But you are saying that you find in the policies, as Pinaki is saying, that less developed economies were able to spend much less. But you know, one thing I think that helped India was the quality of fiscal spending. I like to say that we overreacted in stimulus after the global financial crisis. And then there was too much tightening. So by the time the COVID crisis came, for example, many of the liquidity infusions had automatic, dates by which it would end, right? And government support for SMEs and so on. And then, I think MV Kamath was in charge of a sort of restructuring sort of grant, and actually only 1/10 of what they'd kept aside was used.
Indeed.
Because it wasn't that there's so much money that people just used it to, blow up. They had to really work and find substitutes because there was limited support available. So the growth recovery was good, and therefore the financial sector also did not need that much of a prolonged rescue as it did after the global financial crisis, where support continued too long. So timely support, but some discipline in support, and that support should be more in infrastructure and whatever improves productivity rather than just short-term consumption. Yeah.
And a sunset clause, as you said.
Yes, sunset clause, very
That's
important. It creates good
It's
incentives.
not perennially on tap.
Hmm. Yeah, because because that time there was so much pressure, the way advanced economies were just supporting huge checks to every household, to every industry. Now, if we had done that I was in the AACPM that time, and I remember we had this big discussion online with all the departments there. And, the idea that when there are supply bottlenecks, we make a huge demand infusion, right? And what it would do to India's debt, we already have high debt. And so, targeted spending, and, well thought out structure, the composition of the spending is very important. Yeah.
Professor, can I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
Now, Partha, one issue
Yes.
that I have been thinking about, and in your book, you have a chapter dedicated, and these days, there is so much of importance being given to sub-national and basically to the third tier
You are asking
institutions. But when we are talking of the third tier institutions, I have in mind the Panchayati Raj institutions and the local bodies.
as to what.
Now the issue is, I'm thinking, because you are here, both of us were there at the RBI, we know there was a joint family approach to raising market borrowings for state governments before the auction came in. Right now, there's a change in the government in Delhi, and to clean Yamuna, to make the river bank, these are very expensive things. Where are the resources? So at IIM Bangalore, I had a working paper, and I'm reminded of that. I'm sharing that thought. And if you have some views, I was thinking of having a joint family approach to the local bodies in raising resources which are development oriented. And just keep in mind, at the back of your mind, the railway bonds which were introduced in the US to develop the railways across the country. So people are so much comfortable seeing in front of their eyes that I have subscribed to a bond for this project and I can see the project being implemented right in front of me and my eyes. What would you think of that idea of financial strengthening of the urban local bodies and the PRIs, the third tier?
So I would request Pinaki to add, but essentially the municipal finance market are very, very, scattered. I mean, there are only few success stories, the bigger ones, the smaller ones have not. The financial bond market, RBI has already a report there. We are yet to see a huge amount of degree of vibrancy. Pinaki, please.
Don't you think there's a chicken and egg? I think Charan has raised a very important question. There's a chicken and egg. I remember the 14th Finance Commission felt that you can't have conditional lending because they don't have the capacity. And states say they're not able to decentralize funds and functionaries as the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment says that they should do, because it would all be lost. There's corruption, there's lack of capacity at the lower end. But unless you really put those functionaries there and you put in systems and some of this conditional spending, I believe that panchayat accounts have increased tremendously. They've used some platform and so on. And you can't have capacity building continuing for 30 years if it's not happening. There's some problem there. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Pinaki, you have any comment on this municipal finance third tier?
Well, I think when we talk about decentralization to the third tier, I think we really, it's not part of the book, but my sense is that we really cannot ignore the scale economies. So we have a very complicated three-tier structure within the third tier. So you have district panchayat, then we have block panchayat, we have jala panchayats, and if you look at 15th Finance Commission report, they have talked about shared responsibility. So it's a scale part is just not considered when we talk about decentralization to the third tier. So one is, yes, decentralization, local government closest to the people, but I think we really cannot ignore the scale. So we have to be really realistic about decentralization. That is one. Second question about municipal bonds, etc. I think so long as there is an implicit state government guarantee, it's very difficult to consider these as a major instrument of resource mobilization at the local level. Some municipalities can do, and then the money that has been mobilized is couple of thousand crores, which is nothing compared to the overall financial system, our fiscal system, which has something like 75 lakh crore rupees. So that way, I think large scale investment project through capital market development at the municipal level, I think is a distant dream. It may happen. How much it will happen, I have my own doubts. That's the second point. Third point on the question of local finances, I think where we can really improve is the property taxation. But given that the book was purely on the issue of how money, I'm talking about the second edition, where it was mostly on the post-crisis developments. I think on the taxation side, we have talked about the taxation at the national level, how tax bases have eroded because of thin capitalization, transfer pricing, etc. How global corporates have been avoiding taxes, not evading. But we really have not looked at it in detail. The issue of local level taxation, but I think it's more about local service delivery is intimately linked to the local taxation powers. And if we are talking about government of India and its decentralization and property tax at the local level, the local government still do not have the power to tax property. It is the property tax board, whether the state government decides whether to increase the property tax rate or not. So there is actually no real power at the local level. So if we are really doing property tax reform, I think we can mobilize something like, there are estimates which show that around 2% of GDP can be mobilized from property tax collection alone, from the existing properties regularly collected. So from that point of view, I think issue of resource mobilization has to look at municipal taxes rather than non-debt instruments like bonds at the municipal level. I think that is going to take time. It's not going to happen quickly.
Yes, excellent point. I think, but what is the obstacle to decentralizing property tax part to local government? It's just a question of power or institutional reform.
So I think it's almost like electricity regulators not able to increase tariff. So property tax revenue I think it is extremely political, because after all, increasing rate.
Yeah, and there is a view that the local government will not be able to tax. They don't want to offend people.
Yes, that's a very big issue, and that has got to do also with the service delivery. If the service delivery is very poor, then raising tax rate also becomes extremely difficult for a government which is closest to the people.
The idea is that if it is at the third tier and people are paying, they will insist on better delivery. They're paying to the person who's providing the service. So if you link those two, make the third tier government more accountable. But that is not happening in our country.
Yeah, but please, there are municipalities like Ahmedabad, Bangalore, who did raise resources. So in principle, I totally agree with Pinaki. I think it's one has to be very, very careful in where the resources are being raised, who will guarantee this. But then there are municipal corporations which I thought they were coming up reasonably well, like Ahmedabad, Bangalore, Baroda, when they raised resources, the rich municipal corporations. Other municipal corporations, of course, may not be able to provide collateral or guarantee for a bond. But one thought is, maybe at the third tier, one can think. I leave it that. Thank you for your response.
So I think we are out of time, but if there's any question from the floor, anybody wants to raise a hand? We've seen the questions in the chat box. So as you're saying, this book focuses more on the globe rather than India, but does it segregate between different policies for advanced and less developed countries, etc.?
It does when it discusses the different groups of countries, but it was considered primarily on the advanced countries because the two major crises that we have seen, namely the global financial crisis and euro area crisis, came from advanced countries.
Yes, I think that is why it's important to kind of, bell the cat, as the saying is.
That's right.
And what I think their prudential regulation is very, very inadequate. In India, in emerging markets generally don't regulate entities. They regulate only borrowers, the LTV, etc. So they have no way. So with the focus on bank regulation, the shadow banks have grown in a long way. Almost have grown. All the cross-border funds come from that, and that affects the emerging market. So something about, as you're saying, the global financial architecture is really inadequate, and
Indeed,
we need to sort of
say
raise these
monetary
issues.
non-system.
Yes, that's a very important point to make and to push, and what specifically can be done to improve matters. Yeah. I think one question in the chat box is that what are your suggestions for the future to improve matters and for the different groups of country? So I'm sure you have a lot of that in the book.
Yeah, a lot of that in the book. One general thing is you have to take the financial sector seriously in terms of monetary and fiscal policy. And this is without the public sector ownership as well.
That public ownership is not such a key issue.
You take it.
I think another thing that's worked very well in India is a focus on governance, and entities that have good governance are the ones that have survived and done well.
India.
Okay, so I think we can close.
Professor, before you close, one more question.
Yeah, please. I was going to turn it over to you anyway.
No, because it's very rare that you get this galaxy of people and thinking together. And Partha has been writing this book with Y.V. Reddy, and that's why I asked that question. Partha, Y.V. Reddy has been at the helm of banking regulation. And the role that he played in banking regulation, bringing the NBFCs in the fold, bringing the cooperative banks into the fold, and the way he regulated the banks, and the Nobel laureate saying if he was a Fed chief, this crisis would not have taken place. In the book, I haven't read the whole book, though I've scanned through various pages. In the book, what would be the position that you have taken had the banking entities been very well regulated in 2005, 6, and 7 in the US? Obviously, 2008 would not have taken.
Indeed. That's the position we take. And we also argue that Greenspan's light touch regulation did not work.
Does not.
It did not work. That's the position we have taken.
Fantastic. So I'll just share one anecdote, very relevant for your book, maybe in the third edition. If you're willing to include it, you're happy to. In 2005, I was doing my postdoctorate at Stanford. You know, Partha. So part of my postdoc, I was in the RBI. And at Stanford, the Fed San Francisco was chaired by, she later on became the Fed chief. I'm forgetting her name. Janet Yellen. Janet Yellen. So Janet Yellen was visiting India around October, November 2005.
I remember.
You remember?
I met her.
Yeah, she called me. I was at Stanford in February or March, and she said, I'm preparing to go to Delhi, to Bombay to meet the governor and the RBI. Charan, tell me, how do you regulate such a complex banking system in your country. So she spent, I think I had a meeting with her twice. Now this is 2004-5, long time ago. And she spent, and and her staff, they interacted with me. They wanted to know the complete regulatory mechanism that the Reserve Bank deploys to ensure such a healthy banking system in the country. Dr. Y.V. Reddy, of course, was the governor at that time. It so happened in 2009 or 10, I was at the IMF, and I realized the Fed Reserve has invited a delegation from the Reserve Bank of India now to give a talk on how to regulate. And this is the crisis has already happened, bad things have happened. Now the Fed Reserve has invited from the Reserve Bank of India delegation from the banking department. Tell us how you regulate and what is that we can learn from you in regulating our banking system. Believe me, it was a very proud day for me when I saw the RBI delegations meeting us at the IMF before going to the Fed Reserve to go and speak to Madam Fed Reserve officials and Madam Janet Yellen. So the RBI's regulation has really been celebrated across the world. I thought I'll just share this.
Yes and no, because then if you are being partial to history, because you should remember the NPA debacle later as well. So, and if one has to be objective, one has to take it in strides.
Yeah, but I think the
That's
NPA
my
was
dampener to you,
basically
Charan.
because-
Sorry.
No,
Because
no,
of the
but
absence of
the NPA
DFIs,
debacle.
and the part
I
of the
don't
fiscal
accept it.
stimulus.
Because
Sorry.
the way we handled that NPA debacle, and as luck would have it, now I was chairing a public sector bank, right? When the NPA debacle was unfolding and the banks had to be recapitalized. I think over there also, the government played a very important role.
Indeed, indeed.
Played a very
That's
important role in
talk
the
of a
way we bailed them out.
separate seminar, Charan. That's talk of a
Separate
Yes,
seminar,
yes.
exactly.
Okay.
Really interesting issues. Yeah, I think because banks of DFIs, there were no DFIs, banks were pushed to lend
Yeah,
for
absolutely. To
infrastructure.
the
Set liability
PPPs.
mismatch.
Yeah.
So it was really a government thing, there. Anyway, so some other time.
Yeah.
Yes.
But very interesting discussion. I'm sure everybody enjoyed it. Charan, I'll hand it over to you to close.
Thank you so much. Professor Goyal, I want to thank you for agreeing to chair this. At a very late invitation, you accepted it, so kind of you. Partha and Pinaki, I really want to thank you for coming on this forum and sharing your book. Your first edition was fantastic, so I knew the second edition has to be very, very good. And you finally agreed to come and deliver. So that's very kind of you. And the discussion, as you see, is very enlightening for all of us. So I want to thank you for that. I also want to thank the participants for raising these important issues that have been raised. Next Friday, we have again a very interesting discussion. It is, as you know, the think tank not only does fiscal, monetary, and economic issues, it also does geopolitics. Next week, we are discussing a very important contemporary issue, diplomacy in war. RBI, the government of India's decision to go to 32 countries and in addition to Euro and talk to the world about what terrorism is, because we are in the path to Viksit Bharat, and at this point of time, we are chasing a growth rate and we don't want to be deterred by it. And these skirmishes and terrorist activities only deter us from our growth path. So very important that the global viewpoint is generated. And I think the strategy which was used by the government of diplomacy in war has lots of economic implications, growth-oriented implications. So next week, same time, we'll have diplomats, we'll have people from the delegations who went there, an army general, a person from the media, discuss about this whole issue before us. So I'd welcome you all to be a part of that discussion.
I think
With
now
that-
we more and more need the world to listen to what we are doing, like Janet Yellen listened, rather than try and explain to the rest of the world and seek their approval, right?
Exactly. Exactly. There's so much for us to share now.
Yeah.
So look forward to
Okay.
your participation next week. And once again, thank you for today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.